Hello, First Congregational Church of Oakland. It's been a while since I've been with you, and I'm glad to be back. And I'm honored to have the privilege of sharing this sacred time with you, this time when we're closing out this month of May, this time where we're called to celebrate, where we're called to observe specific things and specific aspects of our history and who we are. And it's also Trinity Sunday, so I'm going to start with Trinity Sunday. So the doctrine of the Trinity has always been a struggle for me. And throughout my life, I've heard different youth leaders and pastors trying to explain it to me. I've heard folks say that the Trinity is like water, right? So water, it can be in the form of a liquid, form of a solid or a gas. Um, that's what it's like to have a triune God. I've heard folks say that the Trinity is like how one person can have many roles and be different things to different people. Like how one person can be someone's mom and auntie and sister and cousin and friend. That's what it's like to have a triune God. I had a difficult time really like resonating with those ways of thinking and talking about the triune God. And then a pastor that I met while I was discerning whether I should go to seminary or not, Reverend Sandy Olawine, described the Trinity to me as God being a communal God, a God that needs community. And that was the most beautiful interpretation of the Trinity I had ever heard at that point. But honestly, I didn't get it. At the time, I hadn't experienced community in a way that that concept would make sense. I was trying to understand this doctrine, this spiritual framework through a much more intellectual level. I am an Enneagram 5 with a 4 wing, those of you who know what that means. So in that sense, I relate to Nicodemus, right? Someone in charge of spiritual life and religious education, but doesn't quite get how Jesus is making all the things happen. Nicodemus trying to approach it all from his usual intellectualized framework, which is probably how he was trained by the institution of which he was part. So it makes sense that this conversation with Jesus about being born from above is a bit of a struggle. And Jesus is right. In our reading, he says, "We speak of what we know and testify to what we have seen." And Nicodemus's lens is influenced by who he is, by what he's experienced, and by how he's been taught to interpret those experiences. So, as it says in my bio, I have a bunch of aspects of my identity that I carry with me always that influence how I navigate the world, my experiences, and how I interpret those experiences. So, I usually start off with naming all of these because I feel like it's a way for the congregation to get to know who I am. So I'm just gonna name some of these real quick in case you didn't catch them in my bio. I'm a brown Asian Filipino Filipinx of the US diaspora, queer, trans non-binary, and neurodivergent. And I'm many other things too. But I mean, like, this time is my time, right? It's May. It's the end of May at that. It's the cusp of Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, Mental Health Awareness Month, and Pride. Like, a lot of a lot of aspects of who I am are being highlighted at this time. So I do appreciate the designated months, but it's always a little awkward for me in the sense that I can't really separate any of my identities from each other. My being a brown, Asian, queer, trans person is inseparable from my neurodivergence, is inseparable from my mental health. When we have mainstream conversations about mental health, I've found that often it's about maintaining our mental health. But for me this year, instead of awareness around mental health, I'm feeling pulled towards the heritage aspect. I know it's not in the name of the month, but it's part of the Asian Pacific American part of it. And like I said, I can't really pull those things apart. So I'm being pulled towards the heritage aspect of what it is to be neurodivergent, or, as someone who is not what they call neurotypical. So neurodivergence, or having brains that are wired differently than what people might call typical or normal, isn't always something that is bad. I think sometimes we do view mental health things as always addressing something that's bad. Um, Neurodivergence impacts how we are as participants in our movements for liberation and as people of faith. I find resonance when I find out about people of faith who are people of color who fought for justice that actually struggled with their mental health. Saint Oscar Romero, for example, was diagnosed by a psychiatrist as having obsessive compulsive disorder, and fellow priests said that he struggled with something called scrupulosity, which is moral or religious anxiety. Moral or religious anxiety that involves shame, that involves guilt. You know, it's something that he wrestled with and actually, as the name says, gave him a lot of anxiety. So while it may have been heavy for Oscar Romero to bear, it also made him the bishop of the people that he was, willing to rise for and with the poor, giving him a deep sense of courageous, righteous conviction to the point of his assassination by state forces. During the pandemic, I attended a workshop on disability justice that was put on by the Senior Disability Action in San Francisco. So I learned there that Harriet Tubman actually suffered from a brain injury when she was hit in the head with an iron weight that an angry overseer threw while trying to hit another enslaved person who was running away. It almost killed her and caused her to have headaches, seizures, and times of semi consciousness. And while she did suffer from the pain, when she was helping to free enslaved folks, she and they interpreted the seizures, visions, and dreams she would have as divine supernatural powers, that it gave her foresight that she would get messages from God and that it helped her to guide enslaved folks through safe passage to freedom. Neurodivergence allows some of us to make connections more easily than others. Connections to people, connections to God, connections to creation, connections between struggles. Neurodivergence allows some of us to observe the world differently, and for some, in ways that make the collective path to liberation more clear and accessible for others. Neurodiversity and people who struggle with their mental health can be great contributors towards making God's kingdom a lived reality for all. At its best, embracing that we do struggle with our mental health can, at times, build our compassion and understanding for others, and can enable us to see those who are often not seen. These aspects of who we are, these aspects where we are often told aren't enough or don't belong, can be aspects that build solidarity and can help us form the united front that we all need in order to tear down the evil, oppressive systems that impact us all. It is this heritage that I would rather build awareness around. Because of the imperialist capitalist systems we live under, the aspects of myself that I named earlier are all aspects that make me the other in many situations and spaces. If we're talking about ghosts at the crossroads this season, this ghost of always second guessing myself haunts me all the time. This ghost that is a byproduct of systemic oppression, that is a byproduct of being othered. This ghost of minimizing my experiences, minimizing my voice and my value. This ghost that makes me forget that I belong to God, that makes me forget that I am part of something bigger than myself, haunts me. I'm constantly having to go through this process of being okay with and embracing who I am. And for my own mental health, it oftentimes makes me react by hiding and self-isolating. Avoiding social media, even if what is on social media are posts in solidarity with or calls for justice of whoever of my people are being uplifted that given day. Like when the calls to stop anti-Asian hate popped off, I had to scroll quickly past those posts. The conversations have always felt incomplete. What about systemic violence waged against Asian peoples historically and today? What about perspectives from Asians who aren't East Asian, or who aren't in academia, or who weren't raised in suburbia, or who are working class, or who grew up in immigrant towns, or who understand that what we are experiencing here as Asians is not and never has been disconnected and isolated from Asia? What about the Asians who don't have bling empire aspirations or aspirations to be electoral figures? What about the Asians who learned the lesson that trying to prove our Americanness would never guarantee us safety? What about Asians that colonized and inflicted violence against other inferior Asian populations? It's quite different than the responses that I see when I post something about people being red tagged and killed in the Philippines, or when trans folks of color are met with violence. And I always wonder, why? Why now? What is different? Why is that trending? I tell you, the part of me that was being beaten down by all of this, by these ghosts, needed to be born anew. Because otherwise, it wanted to be dead, it wanted to disconnect, wanted to go numb, and wanted to hide. So once in a while, I feel like we can't be born anew. But then I see my communities, my peoples, off of social media, in the streets, often not people of faith in God these days, but people who have faith in the people. People for whom the masses are Messiah, as poet Iman Lakaba wrote. These communities who keep me safe when Berkeley police tried to push us around as we were speaking against Urban Shield. Community who kept me safe when we were out against the curfew that Libby Schaff tried to impose in Oakland and we didn't know how she would respond. Community who kept me safe when men in uniform carrying guns tried to intimidate us in the Philippines during the vigil of a human rights worker who was assassinated. Community who brought me food when I was sick or brought me water when they thought I was going to pass out at a mobilization. Community who reminded me that they loved me when my depression got out of hand and I wanted to stop existing. Community who reminded me that I'm not alone when my mom passed away. Being with community committed to liberation at all levels, at different aspects, helps me with my mental health. Here, for me, the line between self-care and collective care blur. They continue to teach me the beauty of the triune God, that it's deeper and somehow more encompassing than the labels that Creator, Christ, and Spirit can ever articulate in words. They help me be born anew, in a sense, because they break me out of my hiding and disconnection. After all, to be born is to become visible, to reconnect differently, emerging from the unknown mystery of the divine womb and brought into a new reality. To be born of water and the spirit, bringing together the seen, water, with the unseen, spirit. The coming together of the material with the ideological, the coming together of practice and theory, the coming together of concrete care or service and love or compassion. When we are born anew, when we are able to be visible in all that we are, all aspects, struggles, wounds, and all, we can be beacons of mutual healing. Our gospel reading today reminds us of God's will for us. God's will is for us, whole and renewed, not for us to be condemned for who we are or who we are not, or for not believing the correct things. God's will ultimately is for us to be born, for us to find healing, even if it is the world that is condemning us. Trinity Sunday reminds us that the nature of God is communal. It humbles us and reminds us of our own need for community. It comforts us and reminds us that we are part of that very same community. It empowers us and reminds us that we are part of the community of saints who have gone before us, who have left us our heritage, the inheritance of our collective and revolutionary power. What connections are beckoning to you? What connections are you being challenged to make that will enhance your presence for justice and compassion? As we close this important month and move towards another, I pray that we use at least this time to embrace the connectivity of the Trinity. May we live into our collective power in ways that transcend borders of nations. May we live into our collective power in ways that unite rather than divide. May we be open to the dynamic wind of the Spirit, ever aware of how she might move amongst us and alongside us, building us, beckoning us towards communities of healing. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Amen. Amen. Amen. Amen.